consequence in November that I'm worried about is giving Kamala Harris a disastrous promotion. Let's say to Kamala Harris, you are fired.
Owning a home is really important for building up wealth in America. It's something you can leave to your grandchildren and as like a legacy.
I had all these policemen around me. It was embarrassing, humiliating. I was so angry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. A little bit of business left over from last night's show. The September 10th scheduled presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It's on. There is a tedious back and forth going on social media. I invite you to follow it there over whether the mics will be muted or unmuted. Go have fun with that. Now, breaking news. Late today, Special Counsel Jack Smith filed a superseding indictment in the January 6th election interference case against former President Trump. The indictment importantly includes the same 4 charges, but has removed some of Trump's alleged conduct. The new filing against Trump comes in light of the Supreme Court's recent ruling on what is or isn't immune in terms of presidential actions, official or otherwise. Scott McFarland joins me now at the table. Scott, I'm always delighted to see you. What does this superseding indictment not only say, but tell us about Jack Smith's absorption or digestion of the Supreme Court ruling on immunity?
Not a surprise at all this happened, but we weren't certain what it was going to look like exactly. We know the superseding indictment, this second attempt to charge Donald Trump with election conspiracy, is 9 pages shorter. A few things are missing. It doesn't have references anymore to allegations he used the Justice Department to push false election claims and to interfere with the election. The Justice Department component is gone after the Supreme Court ruling. There are other little nips and tucks. If you look closely, you'll find them. They now reference January 6th. And some of the things Trump said on January 6th, they now refer to it as a campaign event on January 6th. They didn't previously. They're trying to work around, potentially, this Supreme Court ruling on official acts. Now they're characterizing January 6th as campaign, not official. And they're eliminating the parts that may involve Jeffrey Clark and the Justice Department, if you recall your January 6th history.
Indeed, I do.
A few bottom lines are the same. Still facing 4 felony charges. Still charged in the District of Columbia with an attempt to overturn the 2020 election. Still has to face these charges again. So there's going to be an arraignment at some point in the coming days. Our expectation, based on what Jack Smith, the special counsel's filed today, is that they will not insist on Trump attending in person. Sometimes you don't go to your rearraignment if you're being charged in a superseding indictment, certainly not if you're high profile. So this will happen in due course. And this case is back on track in the courtroom of Judge Tanya Chutkan, the initial judge assigned to it.
I'm so glad you brought up Judge Tanya Chutkan, because it was said by many after the Supreme Court ruling that Judge Chutkan would have to sift and try to decide for herself, for procedural reasons, what is an official act, what isn't. In what sense does this superseding indictment help to clarify that for the judge? Or is it something that she will regard, but only do her own determination of those underlying decisions about what is or isn't a prosecutable official or non-official act?
I think Jack Smith, the special counsel, is trying to make his case right here of what he thinks fits under what the Supreme Court has given him. But it would be stunning not to see the Trump team counterpunch.
Right.
Either through a filing or through an argument in this case about what they think should be removed or why they think this whole thing should be dismissed. It would be not surprising to see him make a motion to dismiss this whole thing again. He made several motions of that kind in the previous case. There are some deadlines that are worth noting. There's a deadline of Friday for these parties to tell Judge Chutkan what they intend to do next. Both parties. So there's going to be another set of filings, certainly from the defense. Then September 5th, which, oh, by the way, is next Thursday. We're already there. There's a hearing scheduled in this case, a status conference in front of Judge Chutkan for both sides to talk about what's coming up and what's next. That could change if they schedule a new arraignment on this new superseding indictment of the former president.
And just as best we can, Scott, give our audience a sense of overall scheduling. This will not be adjudicated in any way materially before the election, and the schedule thereafter the election is in part influenced by the outcome of the election.
Yeah, there's no prospect of this going to trial before the election. That was evaporating when the Supreme Court issued its ruling. And we noticed Jack Smith taking his time in getting back to the court. In fact, he voluntarily delayed one of the deadlines. Clearly, there's no need to be expedient. There's no need to get this done. There's no way to get this done by November 5th. The reality, though, hasn't changed. That this case exists after a future President Trump takes office. It's quite likely this case disappears altogether. So if Jack Smith is trying to fight for a trial and fight to win this case, he would be fighting it without any need to navigate November 5th, because if Donald Trump were to win, this whole thing might be over anyhow.
Scott, many of us have the enjoyable procedure or prospect of talking to voters around the country. I'm going to do that in Michigan in a couple of weeks. You just did it in Virginia for our 3 meals process, which we have 3 meals in a given state. Talk to people through those 3 meals. What'd you learn?
I snuck a 4th meal. You should
know
good.
That to
start with. you got to be smart.
Not a sponsor.
Virginia, is it a battleground state? Is it not a battleground state? There's the premise. The Trump supporters in Virginia would like to say it is. Maybe they're speaking aspirationally. Maybe they're being bullish about it. But before President Biden dropped out, I can tell you my sources in Virginia were getting concerned about the margins in
Unquestionably.
Virginia and the impact that has down ballot on some of the competitive House races. There are more than one competitive House races in Virginia. In some of the blue sections, there's a new aspiration that this is now off the table. Virginia is now suddenly sturdily blue, and that it helps Tim Kaine running for re-election and some of those House candidates. But we were pressing them not on the politics, but on what the issues are that are defining their instincts and their desires for 2024. Let's take a listen to some of what they had to tell us.
Reproductive rights.
That's a top issue.
That's a top issue for me. I feel like some women are put in a predicament where they can't financially keep a certain baby, or, so they just need to have the freedom to do whatever they want to do with their body.
We need someone in our presidency who can make this America work for the working man. It's really looking critical right now, where I don't even know if my grandchildren are going to have a future with this country.
We went to a purple area as well, at least an area of Virginia that's historically purple. That would be Loudoun County, one of the most wealthy counties in America, has notoriously been a battleground in statewide races. I'll tell you, it may have seemed stereotypical, but we heard from so many folks consistently they'd like a more conciliatory Washington, less divisive, less toxic. That is certainly the hopes and desires of people who may find themselves more politically moderate, but it was noteworthy. It was transcendent as we went to the more moderate battleground areas. They'd like the politics and the tenor to just change.
They would like it to change. We shall see if this campaign will leave them satisfied or yet again dissatisfied. Scott MacFarlane, always a great pleasure. Thanks so much. Coming up, a new Biden immigration program has been stopped in its tracks. A federal judge temporarily blocks a landmark effort, quote unquote, to offer some immigrants a path to U.S. citizenship. What the move means for the 500,000 people seeking permanent status here in the United States. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Great to have you with us. A federal judge in Texas has, for the moment, blocked the Biden administration from pushing forward a program that could offer a path to citizenship for about 500,000 undocumented immigrants married to U.S. citizens. That's very key. 16 Republican attorneys general challenged this policy. It was announced in June. The Department of Homeland Security began accepting applications just last week. I want to bring in our immigration reporter, Camilo Montoya Galvez, who joins us from Tempe, Arizona. Camilo, always great to see you and have your expertise. Describe how this plan was meant to work, and just start there and we'll go from there.
Hi, Major. This court ruling is a significant blow to one of 2 major immigration actions taken by President Biden back in June earlier this year. As you know, the president cracked down on asylum processing at the border through one executive action, but weeks after, he issued another one that created this program designed, as you mentioned, to grant temporary legal status to the undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens, as well as a more streamlined process to get green card status, permanent residency, and ultimately U.S. citizenship. And as you mentioned, it would benefit hundreds of thousands of unauthorized immigrants who are married to U.S. citizens, have lived here for at least 10 years, Major, and pass background checks. It is very important to note that this program would not benefit any new arrivals. Those people who have been crossing the border illegally over the past few years in record numbers would not be eligible for this process, and people with serious criminal records would also be ineligible. But now, under this court ruling, that program has been paused. That would have allowed people not only to get those work permits, but also a green card status without having to leave the country, because right now, Major, anyone who marries a U.S. citizen is generally eligible for a green card, but people who have entered the country illegally must generally leave the country, go back to their home country, and then come back to the U.S. legally to get that green card. But they can actually trigger a 10 or 3-year ban from the U.S. in that process. So that prompts many families to forego this process and to remain in legal limbo, if you will. So President Biden actually issued a statement today saying that this policy would promote family unity and that this court ruling could force families to separate. But of course, as you know, these Republican-led states are arguing that this is a policy that rewards illegal immigration and that it exceeds the presidential authority on immigration.
And Camilo, on what basis, legally or constitutionally, did these Republican state attorneys general challenge this? And in what degree did the judge's ruling reflect their interpretation of the law, or just say it needs further study?
That is a critical question, Major. Texas and the other Republican-controlled states challenging this policy have denounced it as an amnesty for people who are here in the country legally, and it does benefit people who are in the country illegally or without legal status, undocumented immigrants, as we refer to them colloquially. But it is important to note that it only benefits people who are already on paper eligible for a green card because of that marriage to a U.S. citizen spouse. Nevertheless, the Republican-led states are arguing in federal court, Major, that the parole authority that the Biden administration has justified this policy and has based its policy under does not allow the administration to create a categorical class-based program for hundreds of thousands of people who otherwise would not be eligible to get a green card without having to leave the country. The judge, importantly, Major, has not ruled on the merits of the case on those legal arguments. Instead, he issued an administrative order to preserve the status quo before the program took effect earlier last week. And so this order is valid for 14 days, but he suggested in that order, Major, that the program could be halted through at least October, that he could extend that pause on the policy. So it is possible that this program, which is a signature immigration policy, could remain blocked through the election.
And then this judge who intervened is probably not the last legal word. At some point, it would be appealed, I would imagine, by the administration to the appellate court of jurisdiction and then possibly to the Supreme Court?
That is right. The administration can actually right now ask the New Orleans Appeals Court to stay that administrative pause on the policy. And if that does not go their way, they can also ask the Supreme Court to take action and intervene on their behalf. But the administration has not taken that action yet. We are expecting both parties, the Republican-led states and the Biden administration, to submit legal documents in the case, and then the judge to rule on whether or not to extend this 14-day pause on the program. So we will keep you all posted.
Camilo Montoya Galvez, always keeping us posted from all parts of the country, in this case, Tempe, Arizona. Thank you very, very much. CBS News foreign correspondent MTS Tayeb is in Tel Aviv for us. MTS, always great to see you. Can you walk us through what we know about this rescue mission and the importance of this hostage being freed from Hamas tunnels?
Major, good to be with you. Well, here in Israel, the rescue of Mr. al-Qadi is being described as nothing short of miraculous. But as we find out more details, it's starting to look like it was something of an accident. We understand that Israeli soldiers were essentially looking through a Hamas tunnel, combing for clues or indeed Hamas fighters, when they came upon a room in which they found Mr. Qadi, who was by himself and with no guards. They identified who he was, took him to a room outside of this tunnel, which was 25 yards below ground, and he was then put on an Israeli military helicopter and taken to a hospital. Now, we went to that hospital, we met with some members of his family, and they told us that although he'd lost weight, he was still in pretty good condition. Now, to answer your question about how significant this is, the bottom line is this, is that Israel says that it is in the southern part of Gaza in order to destroy Hamas's tunnel network. And the fact that they found a hostage in one of those tunnels goes to show that other hostages, some of those who may still be alive, could potentially be there too.
Competing with sirens is always a live television broadcaster's occupational hazard. It is particularly so in Tel Aviv and in the region. MTS, thank you for soldiering on through that so well. Palestinian officials, as you well know, MTS, are reporting a strike in Gaza killed 18, including several children. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, we understand that that strike was carried out in the Khan Yunis area of Gaza, which, of course, has been targeted multiple times. Now, our colleague in Gaza has reported that a relatively senior or well-known businessman was apparently killed in that attack. We don't know whether or not it was targeted or not, but it really just underscores how the death toll in Gaza is only skyrocketing. In fact, over the past 4 days alone, over 250 Palestinians have been killed in a series of strikes across the Gaza Strip, many of those women and children, and it really just underscores just how dire the situation is and how the violence only seems to be getting worse.
And in that context, MTS, we continue to talk about the ceasefire negotiations, but as you just illustrated, the battle continues, the death toll rises. Isn't that kind of where the focus maybe ought to be? Because these ceasefire negotiations seem to be going on and on and on, and yet day in and day out, hour by hour, the death toll rises.
Yeah, the battle continues, the death toll rises, and the hostages, at least the vast majority of them, remain in Hamas custody. We had some hope on Sunday when you had a delegation from Israel, you had a Hamas delegation, you also had the CIA director as well as President Biden's most senior Middle East advisor in Cairo, along with Egyptian and Qatari mediators. Many had hoped that that would be the day that we would see a breakthrough. We have not seen that breakthrough. Those delegations have largely left, but the talks are still ongoing, but they're moving very slowly. But as you can imagine, with the rescue of this hostage, many people here in Israel are very firmly of the opinion that the only way to get the rest of the hostages out, around 110 of them, as we've been saying, around 30 or so are believed to be dead, that the only way to retrieve them, the only way to rescue them is for a deal with Hamas, something that the majority of Israelis want, and of course people in Gaza so desperately want. But it's up to the leaders of Hamas and certainly up to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But both sides saying that there are gaps between them, gaps which they still have yet to close.
MTS Tayeb, as always, thank you very much. Coming to us from Tel Aviv. Mark Zuckerberg says the Biden administration pressured Meta, that's his social media company, to censor, that's the word he used, censor COVID-19 content during the pandemic. What the Meta boss is now saying. That's coming next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg says he will resist attempts from the White House to censor content on his social media platforms. Here's the key phrase, moving forward. This after previously being influenced by U.S. government officials. The tech billionaire submitted a letter to the House Judiciary Committee chairman, that's Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio, saying he now regrets having bowed to what he called pressure, that's a direct quote, from the Biden administration to remove certain content, including posts related to COVID-19 and Hunter Biden. If not remove, at least put lower on the platform. His company, Meta, owns Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. The White House said in response, "We believe tech companies and other private actors should take into account the effects their actions have on the American people while making independent choices about the information they present." For more on this, let's bring in Jolene Kent. Jolene, that's a pretty benign or anodyne statement from the White House. Many people will look at what Mark Zuckerberg has now said to the House Judiciary Committee and say, hey, wait a minute, what happened and why isn't there more outcry?
Yeah, this is interesting because the letter was not published or shared by Mark Zuckerberg or Meta itself. Instead, it was shared by the GOP leadership of the House Judiciary Committee. And what the standout quote really is about what Mark Zuckerberg said happened during the pandemic. And he says, I believe the government pressure was wrong. He says that there were senior officials from the Biden administration that repeatedly pressured Meta to suppress this information about COVID-19 on its platform. He says that I regret that we were not more outspoken about it. And he added that Meta will not be bowing to pressure going forward and that he is ready to push back if something like this happens again. Facebook, Meta is no longer putting out any additional comment from this letter, but we do know that this comes after a House Judiciary investigation into the levels of censorship and expression that are allowed on social media platforms, not just Meta platforms, across the board. This letter was addressed to Republican Representative Jim Jordan on that front, but certainly Mark Zuckerberg tying up the letter, Major, in a really interesting way. He says, in past cycles, he's given money for electoral infrastructure in a nonpartisan way, given millions of dollars to donate to make voting more accessible for people. He says he will not be doing that again this cycle. He wants to maintain a neutral stance. He does not plan to endorse a presidential candidate. He did not endorse 4 years ago, and he doesn't want to give the appearance of anything but neutral as Meta, Facebook, Instagram tried to navigate the waters ahead. Only 69 days to go, Major.
And Jolene, just for the audience's benefit and as a reminder, when you agree to terms of service on any social media platform, you give that platform the right to make decisions of this kind, do you not?
Well, it depends on what the agreements are. Terms of service for individuals like you and I and people who are watching are different than the agreements that are struck by publishers, say the New York Post. Of course, the article in question that was addressed in Zuckerberg's letter today was about Hunter Biden's laptop. There was an FBI warning that it might be Russian disinformation, and it turns out it was not. Zuckerberg says that he wishes he had not waited on the fact checkers and he would have just essentially left the story alone. And so these kind of agreements are all different in nature. And what Meta and what Facebook and Instagram have tried to do lately is try to get out of the business of politics. But what's really protecting them, of course, is Section 230, that very important regulation that allows them not to be responsible for the content that's being shared on their platforms. And that's something that so many lawmakers in Washington on both sides of the aisle would like to see amended going forward. That Section 230 is really what could change the game in a lot of these debates when it comes to quote unquote censorship, demoting, downgrading content, or featuring it and putting it more prominently in the algorithm for you to see, Major.
Key words, prominently in the algorithm. Jolene Kent, thank you very, very much. Former President Trump has added a one-time campaign rival and former Democratic Congresswoman to his presidential transition team. A look at what RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, she's the one I was just referring to, might bring to the Trump team. That's next. You're streaming America Decides.
I know that President Trump understands the grave responsibility that a president and commander-in-chief bears. We saw this through his first term in the presidency, when he not only didn't start any new wars, he took action to de-escalate and prevent wars.
Welcome back to America Decides. You might remember Tulsi Gabbard. She ran for the Democratic nomination in 2020, stayed in the campaign longer than Kamala Harris, by the way, and then later endorsed President Biden in 2020. Now she's officially endorsed former President Trump. And today, Trump announced that Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would have prominent roles in his transition team should there be a need for one. Let us bring in our political panel, Deepa Shivam and Stephanie Lai. Deepa is White House correspondent for NPR, Stephanie, national politics reporter for Bloomberg. So, Deepa, starting with you, what do you think, if anything, Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. bring? I know they bring a kind of energy that's already in the Trump circle and the Trump orbit. do they have any reach outside of that?
I mean, that's the question, right? This is coming as numerous Republicans are coming out and endorsing Kamala Harris. So that's the contrast that's being set up here. Tulsi Gabbard, obviously a former Democrat, as was RFK Jr. You could potentially interpret this as, you know, the Trump campaign saying, okay, we're also going to cast a wide net and reach out to voters who may not agree with us and open that door up. Will it have the same effect? I think that there's probably very few Democratic voters I've heard from who would say, oh, Tulsi Gabbard, she's really influenced the way I think about Democratic politics and the party writ large.
And Stephanie, they're not at the convention. That moment's long since passed. At the Democratic convention, there was a night built around Republicans who served in the Trump administration or elsewhere, said, I'm with Kamala. Maybe only for just this one election, but I'm there nevertheless.
Right, and I think what we're seeing from the Harris campaign is that they don't think that the polling that they have suggests that RFK Jr. voters will turn out for Trump more than they would for Harris. And so while the Trump campaign says otherwise, it doesn't quite seem like there is consensus around how RFK Jr. will impact the vote. And on top of that, we don't actually know if he can get off of all of the ballots that he's trying to get off of.
An excellent point, Stephanie. Wisconsin late this afternoon announced that RFK Jr.'s name staying on the ballot. So is Jill Stein's. So is Cornel West. So all three of those are on the ballot in Wisconsin. And this raises, to me, Deepa, a larger conversation about, did the Trump campaign miss an opportunity to negotiate this out with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. earlier, when it could have mattered? He could have actually had more capability of taking names off ballots.
Right. I mean, but also keep in mind this world that we're living in where there is a Kamala Harris running for president is also very new and recent. So, you know, at a time when Donald Trump might have done that outreach to RFK Jr., Joe Biden might have been at the top of the ticket still. So we're still dealing with a lot of, you know, new territory here that clearly the Trump campaign is trying to navigate and trying to find ways to combat this surge of energy that has come with Kamala Harris taking the top of the ticket.
And Stephanie, we know they had conversations in Milwaukee, and Trump didn't think he needed RFK Jr. then. So they didn't hash out a deal.
They didn't.
Feels like he needs him now, or maybe he needs him more now.
Right, and so that's perhaps why we're seeing all of this come out right now. And in fact, you know, we're seeing the Trump campaign try to seize the spotlight back, and so this is just another part of that. Really, all of these events are building up to him trying to reassert himself on the narrative.
All right, I mentioned this at the top of the show. We don't need to dwell on this, but the debate's on.
The debates.
Deepa, go.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, again, exactly to what you just said, Stephanie. I think maybe an attempt from Donald Trump to keep his name coming up repeatedly in the headlines, which has been working. I mean, every time he sort of swings left or swings right on which direction we're going with the debates here, he sort of elevates the conversation. But at the same time...
Or animates it.
Animates it. At the same time, you know, you have Kamala Harris's campaign saying, you know, we're ready, we're showing up, and also kind of needling Donald Trump a little bit. I don't know if you saw her post on Truth Social. She went on his social media platform, basically, essentially calling Donald Trump a chicken. There was a video of clips of him with chicken noises in the background. So there's some, you know, ways that they're trying to sort of use this to their advantage as well.
Stephanie, I wonder if this is worth noting for more than a minute or two. The Democratic convention and Kamala Harris campaign seems to be less inclined to be triggered by Trump and outraged and appalled and more willing to engage in trolling, mockery, and dismissiveness.
I mean, that's actually something we saw from the Obamas as well. That wasn't necessarily the speech that I expected to hear from the both of them at the DNC. But the fact that the Harris campaign can tap into sort of the Gen Z voter, I think that's why we're seeing this trolling happening. And I think it suggests that there is a little bit more willingness to, you know, sling some mud.
And Deepa, is that about basically saying, look, we know the people who are scared of Donald Trump, who believe he's a monster. They're in the Democratic campaign. They were going to vote for Biden. Now they're going to vote for Harris.
Right.
We don't need to talk to them anymore. What we need to do is talk to the ones who maybe either have tuned that out, are emotionally exhausted by it, and want some other kind of emotional response.
I think it's both and, right? I think the response is, you know, they're looking to attract people who have been looking at our politics essentially since 2016, right? A politics of fear, a politics of a lot of despair, a lot of people feeling very unenthused and unenergized by what they see as two candidates who, quite frankly, are very unpopular, right? Joe Biden and Donald Trump were two extremely unpopular candidates on both sides of the aisle. They were looking for people who were saying, I'm gonna sit this one out. I'm going to stay on the couch. And there are a lot of folks you talk to who are Democrats who are saying this isn't just an election about Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. This is an election about the voters who are turning out and the voters who are saying, I'm picking the couch and I'm staying home. And Kamala Harris's mission, in addition to drawing those contrasts with Donald Trump, is also looking at those voters and saying it's worth it to turn out and vote for me instead of just staying home this year.
Stephanie, you have some reporting about J.D. Vance and the tech world, which we all talked about in Milwaukee, that he would give Trump entree into this. Is one of the reasons Donald Trump Jr. said, hey, Dad, pick J.D. Vance. He's got a following in our world, but he also has this place of significance within the Silicon Valley part of the world that you don't really have access to. Is it making inroads? Is it doing something for the Trump campaign?
I think that's certainly something they've been very focused on. The fact that Trump has made a big play on crypto and, in fact, has drawn some crypto donations from high-profile people.
And when you say make a big play, speaking of it more
right, on the trail. He's
favorably,
yes,
and suggesting perhaps a more accepting regulatory environment for crypto should he be returned to the White House.
Correct. That, in addition to J.D. Vance hosting these fundraisers with big tech names like David Sachs, Jacob Hellberg, these folks are really drawing in a new energy of Trump supporters. And I think they're suggesting that there is a shift happening in San Francisco where these donors are not just sitting on the sidelines or not donating to the Democratic Party as they have in previous cycles, and instead they're starting to come out of the woods a little bit.
Deepa, what does the Harris campaign polls internally, so far as you know about them, tell them about the status of this race?
I mean, there were operatives in Chicago at the DNC who were saying, look, this isn't the rosy picture that, that is being painted by some people. Yes, there's a lot of enthusiasm. Yes, there's a lot of energy, and there's good signs in that. But there are folks who are within this campaign, who are working with this campaign, who will say this is an extremely tight race. There are some states that Kamala Harris is up in and some that she needs to win that currently she's not up in, and they still have a lot of ground to cover. And I think the candidate herself is really aware of that, right? You heard her in Chicago wrap up her convention speech on Thursday night, immediately go rally with supporters and say, celebrate tonight, but you got to get to work tomorrow. This is not an election that is a done deal yet.
Not even close. Deepa Shivam and Stephanie Lai, thank you very much. Always a pleasure. Forced from her home, questioned for hours, and stripped of her cell phone and computer. We will hear next from a woman who says her home was raided as part of the Texas Attorney General's voter fraud investigation. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. An 87-year-old woman who says her home was raided by officials as part of the Texas Attorney General's investigation into allegations of voter fraud tells CBS News those operations, quote, scared the hell, unquote, out of her. Lydia Martinez, a longtime member of the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, says officers questioned her for hours, confiscated her phone and computer, and made her wait outside while searching her residence.
I said, let me get dressed. And she said, oh, go outside.
What were you wearing?
My nightgown, and I had all these policemen around me. It was embarrassing, humiliating. I was so angry. It was horrible.
Texas Republican Attorney General Ken Paxton's office said last week it is investigating what it said were allegations that some organizations in Texas have in the past unlawfully registered non-citizens to vote or engaged in what they described as vote harvesting. Paxton's office has not responded to LULAC's claims that these searches are illegal or its demands for the Justice Department to investigate the tactics of the Attorney General's investigators. Nydia Cavazos is in San Antonio and joins us now. Nydia, you were with our colleague Omar Villafranca during that interview. What else did you learn in the course of that conversation?
Major, good afternoon. Yesterday, when we were able to talk to Lydia, she's the 87-year-old woman out of San Antonio, Texas, we also learned that part of what was confiscated during the raid last week was Lydia's voter certificate, voter registration certificate. This is a license that officially allows her to help out other people to register to vote here in the state of Texas. Now, this is part of Lydia's profession. This is what she dedicates her free time to helping out senior citizens and veterans in the state of Texas. But she says that she doesn't necessarily have a date as to when she will be getting her things back, including her license, her phone, her computer, everything that was confiscated. And so this officially limits her ability to continue to work in the state of Texas. And she says this, above all, is also one of the major disappointments. She doesn't necessarily know if she's going to be able to do this before Election Day in 2024.
And Nydia, did she address, that is to say, Lydia, the underlying investigatory allegations that she somehow did something wrong? Did she address what the concerns are and what her conduct has been?
What's really missing for Lydia and for others that we've been speaking to here on the ground is the why. They don't necessarily know why they were targeted, why they were part of this raid, and what relationship whatsoever they have to this investigation. We know that all of this is part of the election integrity unit from the Paxton's office, and this is a unit that was created back in 2020 in the aftermath of Trump's loss in 2020 and also claiming widespread voter fraud across the country. And so these people are trying to figure out what exactly is their role and if they're going to be able to gather their stuff back and have it in time to also continue doing the work they were doing as community leaders here in San Antonio.
Worth noting that those allegations of widespread national voter fraud in 2020 were never, ever legally substantiated. CBS News first obtained a letter from LULAC to the Department of Justice. Nydia, what does it reveal?
In this letter that CBS obtained, LULAC has officially asked the Justice Department for a federal investigation to investigate Ken Paxton's office, as they are claiming that these searches are unconstitutional and it is called point-blank voter intimidation. On one side, of course, we have claims that this is potential voter fraud, but LULAC is certain that this is just another tactic from Paxton's office in efforts to intimidate voters and to undermine the role that Latino voters will have in the state of Texas for the general elections and also across down-ballot races in November.
Nydia Cavazos coming to us from San Antonio. Thank you very, very much. We are seeing a massive surge in recent voter registration. Next, we'll discuss which candidate might get the biggest boost from those who are just now preparing to vote in November. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. We're tracking something really interesting going on right now. It's a surge in voter registration in key groups ahead of the November election. Among young black women, registration is up more than 175%. You heard that right, more than 175% in 13 states. That's compared to the same time in 2020. This, according to the data firm TargetSmart. Registration has also increased among young Latinas and black Americans. Tom Bonnier joins us now. He's a senior advisor at TargetSmart. Tom, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in. 175%, can that possibly be right? You must have triple-checked this, or many more times than that.
You're right to repeat the number because I've more than triple-checked it. It's incredibly unusual to see changes in voter registration that are anywhere close to this. I mean, to remind people, 175% is almost tripling of registration rates among this specific group. You just don't see that sort of thing happen in elections normally.
And what does that tell us, if anything, about either enthusiasm, attention, propensity to vote for these newly registered participants?
Tells us a lot. The reason that we look at this voter registration data is because the polls will only tell us so much. The polls tell us how people are going to vote. They don't tell us if or who is going to vote. It's a big question. The best indicator of that is the actions that people are taking. Number one, registering to vote. Someone who says, I want to participate in this election. And so as we've seen these questions of which side has the advantage in intensity and enthusiasm, we look for changes in voter registration like this. People who are newly registered to vote are much more likely to vote on Election Day. So it not only means that there's a bigger pool of voters for either campaign to draw from and turn out on Election Day, but generally it's an indicator of a broader enthusiasm among that specific group. So people who are already registered to vote, who look like those voters who are registering to vote, tend to vote at higher rates when you see those surges in registration.
What do we know about Republican registration and men?
Well, for the longest time, really from 2000 forward, we were seeing Republicans winning the registration battle, so to speak, especially in key states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and elsewhere. You were seeing them register more voters. They had more intensity and enthusiasm. And so this is important because our analysis started on July 21st, which is the day that President Biden announced that he'll be withdrawing from the race, and Kamala Harris announced her candidacy. And so that moment seems to be a potential tipping point in this race where we're seeing suddenly Democrats saying, I'm fired up, I want to participate. And since then, you've seen Democrats out registering Republicans.
Now, anyone who does a quick Google search of your name will find out that you're a Democrat. But this is not Democratic or Republican data, and you don't care. What you care is what the data tells you.
The most important thing for us is getting the data right. And so when we run an analysis like this, it's publicly available voter registration data that comes from state election officials. We just take it and we run counts like this. When I was trying to answer an interesting question to me about whether or not we had seen some sort of tangible change in this election that I think a lot of people were feeling.
We can draw some conclusions from demographic data behind someone who registers to vote, but we can't be for certain. But some states do provide partisan information along with registration information. Anything to glean from that?
That's right. So we look at partisanship, as you say. Some states allow people to register with a party. Many do not. So we look at both. In the states that do not allow it, we actually model partisanship. But in those states where it's just partisan registration, we're seeing where prior to this point, July 21st, where we began our analysis, Democrats were about even with Republicans among new registrants. After this date, the gap has increased to close to 20 points in this sample of states. It's a huge increase.
I want to ask you something that overlays registration with polling. Can pollsters add these newly registered voters to their likely voter models? Will they? And if they don't, could they be missing something?
They should. It's difficult. The hardest thing for any pollster to do is to accurately construct a prediction of turnout. Who's going to vote? For a likely voter poll to be perfectly accurate, they have to predict a lot of different demographic groups perfectly. And no one can do that. The hardest thing for pollsters is when there's a lot of volatility in the electorate, when a lot of voters who didn't participate in prior elections come out to vote. Potentially, that's what we're seeing. At least this is an early indicator that we could have a lot of first-time voters. First-time voters generally aren't showing up in these polls. They're generally people who have not been that connected, and they're going to be harder for pollsters to reach.
Tom, I want you to tell the audience a story about Kansas and this data and what you learned in the abortion referendum that was on the ballot there.
Well, there was a similar question 2 years ago after the Dobbs decision, June 24th of 2022, which was how it would impact the electoral environment. The first test of that was a ballot initiative in Kansas that was expected to be very close. In the end, it wasn't. The pro-abortion rights position won by about 18 points. When we looked at the voter registration data to see who was registering in the lead up to that vote, we found something shocking. 70% of the people who were registering to vote were women. It showed that there was an intensity and enthusiasm. Now, in the end, that's what we saw carry through. It's the reason why there wasn't a red wave election, because of that impact from the Dobbs decision. So a similar registration analysis in Kansas, similar to what we're looking at here, showed to have a true impact on the election and be predictive of what would happen a few months later.
Tom Bonnier, Senior Advisor with Target Smart, thank you very much. All this data, really important. We appreciate it. Former President Trump, no hero to the Foo Fighters. Trump played the band's My Hero at his Arizona rally Friday. The Foo Fighters track was an entrance song for former independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. after announcing his endorsement for Trump. A spokesperson for the band told CBS News the Trump campaign did not receive permission to play that song, and their royalties will now go to the Harris Walls campaign. On social media, a Trump spokesperson insinuated that they did have the right to use that song and did so by quoting two Foo Fighters hit titles, saying, "It's times like these, facts matter. Don't be a pretender." Well, that does it for today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.